Welcome, students, to the first lab, which also includes a lecture associated with it. Not all labs will be this way, but this one in particular is important because you're going to need some guidance to fill out this packet, as well as it's always best for us to get on the same page at understanding what science is and is not. And so this lecture often is just covering epistemology, which is the study of science and history of ideas. It's also colloquially known as how we know what we know, when we knew it, and how it has changed over time. Science is a way of knowing. It's a way of garnering knowledge. And we do this through hypothesis testing, and you'll understand the strength of hypothesis as well as what theory means in science. Theory is the utmost. It's the best we have. It is the foremost explanation for any phenomena that we can actually provide in science. And so it's best to know how we actually acquire knowledge and how we're going to use it in this class. Science is a way of garnering knowledge. It's a way of accumulating it. Now, of course, what is knowledge? Knowledge is truth that is believed. Now, of course, you don't have to believe something for it to be true. It can be by default. You can choose to disbelieve truth if you want. But the truth that's there, those that are believing it and understanding it is a better word, are oftentimes scientists and those that are disseminating that information to others. When we look at science, you have to understand that science is looking for a causal explanation between two things. That is, when X occurs, then Y. When A occurs, then B. When you put your hand on a hot stove burner, your hand will burn and it will cause pain, right? So you can see that, one event occurs and then another one follows. We can even talk about things like baking soda and vinegar. You take vinegar and baking soda, you mix them together, then a chemical reaction occurs and it's visible. And we want to be able to observe it every time. Every time that we mix baking soda and vinegar, it fizzes up and causes pressure and, flows over. And we also want empirical observation by independent observers. Understand what empirical is. Science is an empirical enterprise. Empirical means that you can touch it, you can taste it, you can measure it in some way. It can be quantified or qualified on specific terms, as well as when we garner knowledge through this process of science and scientific inquiry, we also need independent observers. You can't just say, oh, I've recorded this and it means that, and I got all my buddies to agree with me, right? They all say I'm correct. Science doesn't really like working that way. It actually likes to find independent observers, other experts in the field that aren't related to you or your friends, that will be critical of your study or your analysis. And this typically happens with peer review. When you create a study, generate a paper, and you want to publish it or send it to a journal, it usually gets sent off to 2 or 3 reviewers who are experts in that field, and they will be the judge whether it's a good enough paper. It's an important study or important information that needs to be disseminated. And then they'll probably offer some critiques or criticisms, usually to make it better, as well as damage control often so that you don't say something that's really silly. When we think about hypothesis testing in science, the strength of hypothesis is that it can be proven wrong. And we don't necessarily prove things in science, and you may want to just get rid of that word prove out of your head. We continually demonstrate things to be false or we fail to do so. That is, either you support a hypothesis or you reject it, or you can use reject or fail to reject. And we'll move into hypothesis testing in a second. So falsifiability is really important because you can create an idea or a hypothesis, which is just an educated guess, and then you can test it. But oftentimes you can create an idea about how something works or anything, and then you can gather the information and data that says you're correct. Well, and that can be easily done. You can see a lot of politicians do this. But what a scientist is doing is saying, I'm going to try find information, locate information that will prove this wrong, that will demonstrate to be false. Now, if you can't demonstrate to be false, then oftentimes this means that it's correct by default. Science has little to say about unobservable events, things that you cannot see even with high-level microscopes, or supernatural processes, or unique events like a miracle, or, apparition, ghosts, right? Some people will say this, well, this is outside the realm of science. And it's true. We don't know how to explain some of the phenomena that we notice on things like Ghost Hunters International, or Ghost Hunters, some of these shows, because they happen once, or you've recorded it once. And as well as you also have to be careful about information, because humans, we recognize patterns. We're really good at doing it. You're faster at doing it than a computer in some ways, if they're not that complex. Humans oftentimes make sense of information that does not have a pattern. Look at a number of conspiracy theories that have been generated over the coronavirus. Right? That can be challenging as a part of science. One of the best parts of science, what I like about science, and hopefully this is imparted on you, science always makes claims that are provisional. Any new information can come in and change our ideas about how things work or natural phenomena. This is what I want to hand off to you as a fledgling scientist or somebody who's trying to hone their critical faculties and use scientific inquiry to be successful in life and make better, rational decisions. Science is always a realm that contains claims and statements that are always provisional. So we have scientists that spend their whole lives trying to reject ideas like the Big Bang Theory. Big Bang Theory, which states that the universe was maybe a small particle, infinitesimally small, and now the universe is in a stage of protraction. The universe just protracts and contracts. But at some point, there was a huge event that caused the birth of many of these, like celestial bodies we would think of, stars and planets. And that's our best explanation for the universe. But it has been modified, the Big Bang Theory, slightly. Not the TV show, right? Scientific theory. And at the same time, there are scientists that are spending every day, every minute, hour of their life, trying to reject the Big Bang Theory. And we've rejected, actually, some components of it has been revised. And it might fall by the wayside as an explanation for the universe in our lifetime. And that's the beauty of science. New information has come in. We know more. We have to change our explanations. Let me move into hypothesis testing. All a hypothesis is an educated guess about how something works. Now, of course, it has to be a hypothesis that has merit, that will make a contribution. It's not just about everything that you can make a guess about, like how much change is in my pocket. That doesn't move forward with the ideas that would be something that would propel us to garnering knowledge. Now, the fact that I've changed my pocket might be amazing because there's a big coin shortage, right? And so we don't really prove hypotheses. We repeatedly fail to reject them under specific conditions or even all conditions. And this is what falsifiable means. We can gather information that will prove or support our ideas, but if we can reject those ideas, then we're removing some of that confirmation bias by just getting information that supports ideas. You do this all the time in your daily life with your conscious and subconscious, where you may have some behavior in a specific social situation, and then you think about all the information that occurred during it or around or before and after that supports your decision to do that. And that's oftentimes known as confirmation bias. And that's difficult to remove. Well, creating hypotheses that you are failing to reject or trying to prove wrong, that has greater strength because it removes that bias. There are two things to be a good critical thinker and aspect of science, and those two things are data and interpretation. Data is information or evidence that's been collected through an empirical process, and then interpretation is taking that data and information and then trying to create an explanation. So a hypothesis that you have failed to reject over and over again, if it actually is a really good hypothesis, like, what goes up must come down, you cannot reject that statement, at least on planet Earth. There are different things like boundary conditions, but you cannot reject that statement. And nobody's trying to test that statement, really, at least on Earth. We're doing it in other places like space, other planets, something like that, evaluating things like gravity, right? That's the law of gravity. And we'd have high confidence in this hypothesis that we could probably call it a law. And there aren't many true laws out there. Many scientists, goodness, even in the latter half of the 20th century, were trying to just really find laws in nature. And as science has evolved, we found that there are very little that are uniform and ubiquitous. But gravity, law of gravity, at least in specific areas, has been consistent. You cannot reject it. Now, the theory of gravity, now that is way more influential, because you can see the pattern, right? I can throw a ball up in the air and it will come down. I can test it every time. It's going to happen every single time. You assume every time you wake up in the morning that gravity will be the same as it was the day before. You don't even really think about it. But what's more important in this way, because it's correct by default, is to explain what is happening. What is causing this ball to go down? Is it the ball being attracted to the earth, or is it the earth being attracted to the object? Matter of fact, physicists or is it both? Physicists are arguing about this as we speak. So understand that hypothesis and law are kind of like the data aspect, collecting information and trying to find causal connections, and theory is the interpretation or the explanation. This now brings us to an exercise in epistemology, an epistemological experiment. And this chart is on the first page of Lab 1. So you already have it. You can start working on it. Not that you have before. You can do the lab and listen to this lecture several times in tandem. But to help you explain this chart that's on the bottom of the first page of the lab, what we have is kind of like a Venn diagram or some types of logic chart. And we have a rectangle, right? And the rectangle has every possible idea. The realm of every possible idea is within that rectangle. That would mean any idea is. Any idea that anybody has would go in there. But where does it eventually fall is an important question. Look at some of the ideas that are outside of the circle of belief and truth and knowledge, which is one circle in and of itself. Things like the universe is chewing gum, right? As a hypothesis. We probably can reject that. The universe, what actually is it? Well, it doesn't sound like it's chewing gum. Thunder smells like bacon. That sounds really silly because thunder is a sound and it's talking about the smell of bacon. This you could actually test, right? We could reject it outright, the difference between sounds and smells, but some people do argue that they can smell certain sounds, believe it or not. So we could try and test this. If every time someone hears thunder, do they immediately make bacon after that? We could actually wait for another monsoon, wait for thunder, and then record what people actually consume after they hear it. Now, would that mean that thunder smells like bacon? We may not still have been able to demonstrate this. What about kittens cause bad breath? Anybody that has halitosis or bad breath, we would look at their life history and then find out they were exposed to kittens. And then we could make the causal connection between kittens and the exposure and causing bad breath. Well, here's a problem with a number of these ideas that are within the realm of every possible idea. There's something known as correlation does not equal causation. In science, we're looking for natural causal connections between two events. Oftentimes, one of them is correlated with the other. One follows the other thereafter. And they're correlated. It's not because that it actually is caused by that. So remember, that's a fallacy in logic too. Correlation does not equal causation. And then let's move into the circle of belief here. And let's talk about some ideas that are within the realm of every possible idea, but they are believed, but not considered knowledge or truth. For instance, the Earth is 6,000 years old. We think the Earth is about 4 billion years old. Matter of fact, 4.5, 4.6, some estimates are 4.7 billion years old. And then, of course, if you believe this, where does it come from? Well, how do you know that? How do you know that the Earth is 6,000 years old? Oftentimes, this comes from the book of Genesis, where in there it starts with Ibrahim, who was the father of all three major monotheistic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. In there, it talks about what is known as begot. Abraham begot, Cain and Abel begot, so on and so forth. Begot means generation time. So if you count the number of begots in Genesis and you multiply by the minimum generation time in humans, which is once a woman, goes through menarche or has her period, now she may be able to have fertile offspring. Multiply that interbirth interval, which is about 13, 14 years, give or take. Multiply by that by the number of begots, and typically you get 5,000 to 6,000 years old. But this is from a document. It's not necessarily empirical evidence from the natural world. Other things that are believed that are within the realm of every possibility, but that's not considered knowledge, are things like the aliens built the pyramids. No, that's very silly. We know that actually humans built pyramids all over the world and figured out how to create this type of monumental architecture. And archaeologists, we actually create experiments to demonstrate that people back then with their technology were able to build these things. As well as once you start taking pieces away of the blocks of the Great Pyramid of Giza, for instance, because it's usually referenced, the one in Egypt, the Great Pyramids, all three of them, there's trash inside. It's not this perfect, block pyramid. There's trash, there are imperfections. That's because humans built that stuff. Another one that has gained popularity even in the past decade or so is that the Earth is flat. We've known since the ancient Greeks that the Earth is round. Matter of fact, we've had people thousands of years before calculate the circumference of the earth and be correct. Where does this idea come from? You can think about your perception that the earth is flat, but in fact, it's round. You can look at other celestial bodies in space, like the sun or the moon, and you can see that they're round. They're circular, they're spherical. You can then assume that what you're standing on is also that way. But you have to think in society, right? Where do these ideas come from? And science is usually one that prevails. Well, let's talk about something that is knowledge. Matter is made of atoms. Matter of fact, atoms are made of protons, neutrons, electrons. And we know that there are even subatomic particles like quarks and another one called the Higgs boson that was recently discovered, dark matter. So we're continually learning more about smaller and smaller things. Now, of course, as humans, we assign things arbitrarily, meaning that we assign things randomly. There's nothing inherent about me being named Bill that, I'm Bill. You may have some individuals say, oh, you definitely look like a Bill. But, your parents did have some idea of how to name you, but it was done in mostly a random process. And so matter could be made of monkeys or squirrels. You would know what I'm talking about. You're okay, a squirrel, protons, neutrons, electrons, right? Hopefully you get the idea. Now, this information has been vetted and it's considered knowledge because it's truth and it's also believed by some of our, top thinkers and has been demonstrated. Matter can neither be created nor destroyed. That's in every biology textbook. It was written by a Roman philosopher named Lucretius in 50 BC, talking about atomic theory and a particle that has to have specific components as the smallest object or anything we have. Now we know there are smaller things, but that's a true statement. And if we think about knowledge in this way, why is truth outside of knowledge and belief, but still within every realm of any possible idea? Well, that's because there are some truths that we may never know. Matter of fact, there are some truths that we would hope to know, and that science actually eats into that crescent moon of truth until it's a very small sliver. But again, we do know that there are things we may never know. For instance, we may never be able to sequence the DNA of the dinosaurs. So you're thinking to yourself that, well, what if a mosquito landed on one of the dinosaurs and bit it and took some of the blood, and then it went on a tree, and then some sap encased it, and then it fossilized, it became amber, and we drilled a hole inside and got the blood, and then got the DNA from that. That's possible. That's the Jurassic Park, Jurassic World idea. But at the same time, you're not going to get the full genome of DNA. You're going to have to splice bits and pieces in there, and it won't be the original creature. As well as most dinosaur material is fossilized. It's sediment. It's turned to stone. And so there's no organic material left. We can't even extract DNA from it. So you can see that there presents truths that we may never know right away in aspects of science, and understanding how you know what you know is an important question, and this is something you should be asking yourself in anything that you think you know, or how do you know it? The term theory in science gets a really bad rap. It probably is one of the most misunderstood, and that's because there's another definition for theory in the English language, which means how things should be. Now, you can think about a theory of education or a theory of weightlifting, for instance. That's you describing how things should be. Now, there could be some empirical information that suggests that this is really important, makes a good contribution, but it's not the same term that we use in science. In science, a theory is a well-established set of ideas, interrelated facts, and laws to explain diverse events and phenomena. Phenomena, plural, not phenomenon, which is singular, right? So we can't just blurt out a fact and that be a theory. We have to gather several of them to explain something. Let me give you a few examples, right? And of course, when you hear an individual say, well, that's just a theory, they might be thinking to themselves of the other definition for theory in English. But if they are, negligent in this way, that usually means that you're just saying, oh, well, that's just a theory, and or that's just Godzilla, and he's breathing fire and destroying the city, or Mothra, or, oh, hey, there's Thanos. He's an Eternal. Only a few Marvel characters can kill him, and, that he's just there, right? This huge, insurmountable force, or what I'm likening it to, lots and lots of information about a particular subject that scientists have painstakingly gone through to create an idea which most scientists have created a consensus around is the explanation we should use for that phenomena. Let's give you a few examples. Like germ theory. There are two aspects of germ theory. One are the sex cells or gametes or germs that are produced for sexual reproduction. When you look at humans, we have 46 chromosomes and 23 pairs. That makes up you in each one of your cells, specialized cells. But the germ cells have 23, exactly half. Every sexually reproducing organism, with a few exceptions, will have half of its information encased in its gametes or sex cells, right? As well as the other aspect of it is that microorganisms cause disease. You know that by default. You don't even question it. You go to the bathroom, you wash your hands. You're taught to wash your hands as a child. You didn't ask, well, how do you know that? How do you know that we need to do this? Right? Well, it's because we understand that microorganisms cause disease. That's a theoretical statement. We know that the microorganisms can affect us in different ways, and there are good microorganisms. That's why it's not necessarily a law. But again, think about how much information, how many hypotheses tests had to conclude in order for us to make that statement. Gravitational theory, right? We can talk about the law of gravity. This is why it's both a law and a theory. We can talk about the law of gravity. What goes up must come down. But then let's talk about why or how. These are the most important aspects and questions in science. The who, what, when, and where, that's typically your hypothesis testing, your laws, and your facts. The how and the why is the hardest questions in science. Those are theoretical statements, right? And so objects are attracted to the earth, or the earth is attracted to the objects because of gravitational forces. That's a law. It is a theory because it's kind of explaining, but it's not quite getting to the crux of it. But you can see that sometimes things are laws in theory, because if it is a law, it's talking about a causal connection between two things or more. And then how do you explain it? Well, oftentimes you have to restate the hypothesis, and it just so happens that it's a law and it explains something, and you can repeat it, and that's also a theoretical statement. The same for something that Albert Einstein came up with, which is the theory of relativity. E equals mc squared. That was a hypothesis he came up with, but then nobody was able to reject it. Matter of fact, still nobody is able to reject it. They're trying to do it right now. Still have not. Energy equals mass times a constant, which is the speed of light. And so, foremost experts can come up with a hypothesis that is also a law. And of course, just by repeating that, energy equals mass times the speed of light, I am explaining, right, what that is. It's also a law. Quantum theory, this is how we can get, lots and lots of information and very small, very small objects. It also has to do with things like quantum computing, and it's very complex. I don't even really delve into it, but it is there. They are theoretical statements. Evolutionary theory. Evolution is a law. That's what I'm going to show you. Evolution is just a change in gene or allele frequencies over time. And the key is, what is causing that change? Genes can change over time between generations and organisms, for instance, humans, and it can be random, right? We can conduct a bunch of statistical models, and then we're looking at the changes, and somebody says, oh, this is just random. I mean, the population is evolving, but it's just random change. Now, there are other theoretical explanations, like migration. You know, one population moving to another country or continent. Matter of fact, a country like Germany took 1 million refugees from the civil war crisis in Syria. In a few generations, we're going to have more Middle Eastern DNA among German people. Their population is evolving. But why and how? The key theoretical statements. Well, we can explain that because of migration from Syria, from the Middle East. Of course, a very popular theoretical explanation in evolution is natural selection, the idea that Charles Darwin came up with. We're going to explore that. Matter of fact, we don't have any models that demonstrate natural selection. We reject all the other ideas, and natural selection oftentimes is the only explanation left. So, key in theory and science, one of the most important aspects of science that we actually have. Well, maybe you need something to grasp in terms of this concept. Well, let's give you an example of a well-supported hypothesis in biological or physical anthropology, right? The class that you're taking. This is also the last part of Lab 1, is for you to come up with a theoretical explanation for this phenomenon. A hypothesis that's typically well supported is that primates that eat leaves or insects evolve long shearing crests on their teeth. Look at the image in here that's on your lab as well as on this slide. What you have to the left are the tooth rows of particular primates. This is the business end of the tooth that makes contact with food and other teeth. This is the maxilla or upper jaw that's been turned upside down so you can actually see these grooves on the teeth. You'll notice that if you look at on the right, fruit, leaves, and insects, we have documented these creatures in the wild and notice that these are their main foodstuffs. Now, of course, they might eat other things like gums and saps, and some other fruit eaters will eat meat. We'll learn about primates that do, like baboons and chimpanzee. So don't think it's completely exclusive or mutually exclusive. There are primates that more than others have either stricter diets or ones that are much more loose in terms of their ability to get diverse foodstuffs. But notice the business end of the teeth on the leaf eaters and the insect eaters. The insect eater has very, very sharp teeth. And if you want to find insects, you got to be quick, you got to know where to get them, and you got to have sharp teeth to break up the exoskeleton or chitin of an insect. Leaves are soft, but they're tough. And you also need a sharp implement. And you'll notice that the leaf eater has very sharp teeth. Some of the teeth have been worn down a little bit because over time, your teeth will actually produce wear. Just like how your shoes get worn. Your teeth get worn as well. Look at the fruit eater. Fruit eater has very round cusps. These are the ridges on teeth. Sharp cusps on the insect eater and the leaf eater, but very round and bulbous on the fruit eater. This is because you need something blunt to mash up fruit and get the pulp and the juices. That's what you're concerned with. So think about even with the insects and the leaves, right? Think about the teeth of the tools that break down those foodstuffs. You need something sharp for leaves and insects. You need something blunt, like a mortar and a pestle or a molcajete for something like fruit. Because you can think about putting a leaf in a molcajete or a mortar and pestle and pound it. Nothing may happen. The leaf will get flatter than it was before. Something sharp will break it up. Now, the fruit in the molcajete or the mortar and pestle will be very successful in at least extracting the juices. That's what you're concerned with. So in your lab, I want you to create an explanation of why these two things are connected, the causal connection. Teeth evolved to suit the types of food that they consume, and then having specific types of tools are important to break those food stuff down. In your own words, right? Take a wild guess. What do your teeth look like? Fruit, leaf, or insect eater? If you said fruit, you're right. Our teeth look like fruit eaters in terms of, if we look at all primates, of course, think about it. We don't just eat fruit. We eat all sorts of different things. So again, this isn't mutually exclusive, but we do see a well-supported pattern. It's not a law in biological anthropology, but this is actually a pretty consistent and well-supported hypothesis that we observe with teeth and foodstuffs.